She has also served as chair of the Humanities Nebraska Board, president of the Nebraska State Historical Society Board, and chair of the Nebraska Sesquicentennial Commission. And she is the current chair of the Nebraska Hall of Fame Commission. She also is a member of the Humanities Nebraska Speakers Bureau. Please welcome Sara Crook. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Crook has invited you to ask your questions as they occur to you throughout the talk, if you wish to do that. Thank
Classroom teacher for 42 years, so I'm used to interaction, so you don't have to wait till the end to ask questions. So, as you heard, currently the chairman of the Nebraska Hall of Fame, and I just thought this might be a really good topic to help share the process and who's in it, and then I really want at the end for people to banter around some possibilities for the future. So there we go. So I'll start with some specifics about the Hall of Fame in particular. It was established by Nebraska legislature in 1961. I would assume in large anticipation of the centennial for the state that was coming up in 1967. There are 3 ways to qualify, and the thing that a lot of people think is that these are all requirements. No, you can qualify for the Nebraska Hall of Fame if one of these is true of the particular candidate. So if you're born in Nebraska, you do qualify. There were those who were a little upset with the recent induction of Malcolm X because he left Nebraska. He was born in Nebraska in Omaha, but he left at about 18 months of age, never to return except for one speaking engagement in his adult life. But that alone qualifies him to be a Nebraska Hall of Fame member if you're born in Nebraska. Or you don't have to be born in Nebraska, but that you gain prominence while living in Nebraska. Then you would qualify as a Nebraska Hall of Fame member. Or, not and, but or, your residence in Nebraska was an important factor in your life. So maybe you weren't born in Nebraska, but you grew up in Nebraska and then you moved away and achieved fame. But those years of growing up in Nebraska was an important factor in your achieving fame. So those are really broad parameters for qualifying to be born, or to be in the Nebraska Hall of Fame. It's really, I made the comment when we were talking about Malcolm X, technically Gerald Ford, when he meets other requirements, which I'll talk about in a second, he was born Leslie King, thank you. Leslie King Jr. in Omaha. He would technically qualify for the Nebraska Hall of Fame, although I'm sure very few people knew that he was actually born in Nebraska. Other Hall of Fame criteria, HOF, Hall of Fame criteria, is that we only pick one person every 5 years. That originally they picked one about every year when it was first formed in 1961. But since, I don't think I wrote it up there, I have it on the sheet. Starting in the late 90s, I was trying to remember, in 1990s, yeah, until 1996 we named one person every 2 years. But since 1996 now, we only get to select one person. A couple years, well, probably 7-8 years ago, we had a couple that were nominated. We can't pick 2, even if they're a couple. It has to just be one person, and every 5 years, so we have a 5-year process. I'll talk about more than that. And then here's the other kicker that was changed in 1996. Originally, there was no requirement for how long they had to be deceased. Then they changed it to 10 years. Starting in 1996, they have to be deceased at least 35 years. What I've read about that is that there was a case where they thought one person was chosen for the Hall of Fame and it was a bunch of that person's family and business partners, etc., who had pushed it, and that seemed to be an unfair advantage. And so now the idea is that if you have to be deceased 35 years, that your business partners, your personal friends would probably be deceased as well. Sir, you have a question.
The legislature sets these criteria?
The legislature has said that. This is in legislative statute. This, not the Hall of Fame, it's in legislative statute. Our charges to the Hall of Fame Commission. So we don't have a say over this. This is what we've been told that we shall do. He knows. That was my husband that asked that question. He knows that here in our very last round, we did get the nomination for Johnny Carson. And of course, he died in 2005, which means he's not eligible until 2040. And the nominator said, well, but, it's such an immense, person. How can, you can't wait 35 years. I'm a rules person. I always joke with people. I have a last name of Crook. You got to follow the rules. And I'm, the rules are the rules. It's 35 years now. So there you go. And then the other thing, and because we've had some good nominations for this, emphasis is to be given to social or cultural accomplishments, as opposed, and it specifically says over sports and entertainment. And let me throw this out to you. Somebody said, well, Tom Osborne, he probably wouldn't, he's not eligible. He's not dead yet, first off. That's a good thing. So we got to wait another, at least 35 years and hopefully longer for that to happen. But he might make it for teammates, his program of teammates. And oftentimes people who are, big in sports or entertainment will make it on because they've used that celebrity status to do other things. So we had Grover Cleveland Alexander has been a nominee. Well, I've been on the Hall of Fame Commission for 3 rounds now, and Grover Cleveland Alexander, famous pro baseball player from St. Paul, Nebraska, has been nominated at least 2 of those 3 times, and they make a great case for him. But yeah, we see the legislative statute that says if you have other people that are also good candidates that are in that social and cultural aspect, they're to be given preference over. And again, that's by legislative statute, so there you go. Okay, so who knows the first person inducted? Oh, you do know him. It's a famous Nebraskan. Yes.
J. Sterling Morton?
No, but he was one of the early ones.
Okay. Willa Cather.
Again, father of our day.
Willa Cather.
Number 2, I'll get to her. She was number 2, which is good for women.
William Jennings Bryan.
No. And again, an early one. Again, the only presidential candidate from Nebraska, unless you consider Gerald Ford. And William Jennings Bryan wasn't born in Nebraska. He moved to Nebraska. But we'll come back to him in a little bit too. Person, if I say born in Ohio, mother was widowed, had many children, moved to Nebraska. He set up a law practice in McCook. And became famous in Nebraska for many others.
The governor guy.
Not the governor. Oh, you all know.
I know. Oh.
Okay, I'll put you out of your misery.
Norris.
George Norris.
Wasn't a
George Norris. And again, not a native-born Nebraskan by any means at all. So a little bit about George Norris. He was originally elected to the House of Representatives and served there for 10 years. Then after that, he ran for the U.S. Senate and served 5 terms for a total of 30 years. So he represented Nebraska in Congress for a total of 40 years. He was the original sponsor. Everybody can say they're a sponsor of a legislative bill, but he was the original sponsor of the Lame Duck Amendment, which is the 20th Amendment, that shortened that time period from when a person got elected in the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November to January 20th. Because it used to be presidents didn't take office till March 4th. And of course, he introduced this shortly after the Hoover to FDR transition, when all the banks closed, et cetera, between when FDR got elected in November and he didn't take office till March 4th. And you know, some people criticize Norris because, we'll tell you, Norris was a registered Republican, but one of the things he did quite often that angered the Republican Party was if he thought of, you know, so here's going to shorten the period between when a president's elected and taking office, and we're talking a Democrat. But he said, you know, that was such a terrible transition when we had all those bank failures, that once the people have spoken, then that transition needs to happen faster. So he was the original sponsor. If you were in here for Amber's presentation, Kirkendall, on the Black homesteaders, she mentioned the Kincaid Act, and I had just recently read this as well. Amber, by the way, was one of my former students, so that was great to see her. That the Kincaid Act was actually proposed by Moses Kincaid, but he and Senator Norris had been talking about this idea that to make the Homestead Act work in Nebraska, you needed more than 160 acres. That's just a quarter section, particularly in the sandhills where it's mainly grassland. So Norris and Moses Kincaid had been talking about it. It was actually Norris's idea, and then Kincaid entered it as a bill in the House before Norris did. Norris was never very happy about that because, of course, it became known as the Kincaid Act. And supposedly, according to Norris, it was his idea, and Kincaid took it and ran with it. And then the act became known as the Kincaid Act. But Norris, he had bigger fish to fry, I guess you could say. He would go on. He was one of FDR's strong supporters. Again, he's a Republican. FDR is a Democrat. But he was a big supporter of TVA, which was the Tennessee Valley Authority, taking the Tennessee River there in the Appalachian Mountains, which was a very rural, underdeveloped region of the United States, and building a series of dams to generate cheap electricity so those people could have electricity. He could see, this would have been in the early 30s, mid-30s, that much of Nebraska didn't have electricity. And he's like, why don't we create, you know, he began to understand that electricity was necessary for a nation moving forward. And so he was totally behind TVA, again, angering the Republican Party not only in Nebraska, but at the national level as well. And if you didn't know, as a result of his role in that effort to push for the TVA, which of course did happen, that he also then pushed for the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, which developed cheap electricity. When I would talk to my students, I'd often liken it to the post office. If you and we all can have a discussion about the postal service, but it was Benjamin Franklin that said that for a democratic society to exist, they had to have equal access to information, not necessarily free. Post office isn't free, but equal access. So if you think about it, if you're mailing a letter from you, or we have a guy that lives across the road from us, and our mailboxes sit side by side, but it would still take the same stamp if I want to send it to his mailbox, which is right next to mine, or if I want to send it to California, right? And it doesn't matter whether you live in an apartment complex where they can put all your mail together, or you come to my house out in the country and have to, you know, you don't have to pay more to send me information than you would to your neighbor next door. Well, he thought that electricity should be borne, the cost of electricity should be borne by everybody, no matter how remote you are. Because electric companies wanted to charge by, you know, the cost of getting that electricity to you. Well, it'd be cheap in town, but nobody could afford to live in the country. Much like, you know, so if you think about it, he thought electricity ought to be like the Postal Service, that everybody paid for it and you all paid the same, regardless. And so the rural electrification, and again, Nebraska's largely rural, so it was a very politically acceptable position to take on his part. But REA was huge. I have an uncle that lived in his late 90s, that grew up in that era, just kept saying that electricity for Nebraska in the 1940s was huge. And urban centers had it, but rural areas didn't. I don't see anybody old enough here to remember growing up without electricity. You probably heard her say, I went to a country school. I keep thinking I must be a dinosaur, but anyway. My kindergarten year in country school, we had electricity, but we didn't have indoor plumbing. And as a kindergartner, we had to go outside to the outhouse, and we had to go outside to pump the well to get water. And then between my kindergarten year and first grade year is when we got electricity and a heater and all that. Before that, they had like a potbelly stove. You know, when you think about that, again, I don't think I'm that old, but those are huge changes for rural America to have access to that electricity. And as a result, it was Norris who also strongly promoted that public power should be a taxpayer and not a private enterprise. So Nebraska is the only state that gets our electrical sources as a public power. All the other states, those are private companies. Like when Texas had that meltdown here a couple years ago, those are private companies. But Nebraska is the only one. And then, of course, the other thing he's probably best known for is the fact that, and this stems from his own political experience, that Nebraska is the only state that has a technically nonpartisan state legislature and a unicameral. And his argument was, having served a long time, obviously, because this was toward the end of his years as a senator, that he was out promoting the Nebraska unicameral, because he didn't like what was happening in Congress. Because he said what was happening in Congress is the House would pass a bill on a particular topic, and then the Senate would pass a bill on the same topic, but they weren't the same. Imagine that, but they wouldn't be the same. And so a person could say, well, I voted for this House bill, but then because that Senate bill was different, it has to go to a conference committee. And the conference committee is made up of individuals from the House committee and the Senate committee that heard the original bills. In the conference committee, they hash out their differences, and then they send it back to the two chambers. It has to pass both the House and the Senate again before it can go on to the, so if the House says yes and the Senate says no, the bill's dead. Okay. He called that conference committee the hidden chamber of the legislative process. Because then what would happen is, you know, sometimes what came out of there didn't look like either bill. It'd go back to those two chambers. And a person on the second round, so you're the House person that maybe said yes to the House version, but then no to the conference committee version. Well, when they went out to the people, they could just say, well, I voted for that bill if they thought that's what you wanted. Or if they went to another group and they thought that wasn't what you wanted, they could say, oh, I voted against that bill. Because it was two different bills. It was two different bills. So it just, he said, you know, why are we mucking this up? And of course, the argument was that the Senate and House was set up, of course, for the concept that it was a check and balance. And it really was just a compromise to make Rhode Island and New Jersey and those small states happy. And he said, we don't need that in Nebraska. We're not, you know, because you can't, real quick, I'm digressing a little bit, but there were some states that did that like their lower chamber by population and then their upper chambers by counties. So that every county had a vote, kind of like in the Senate, every state has a vote. But the Supreme Court ruled that unconstitutional. And then people say, well, why isn't the Senate unconstitutional? It can't be unconstitutional if it's in the Constitution. So that's why the Senate can do it. Anyway, I digress. But he just kept saying, we don't need a hidden chamber. Let's make this transparent. But then they built in some processes. There are more processes. There require 3 readings to get through the unicameral, 3 public readings to get through the unicameral, and they don't have to do that in any other state. And the idea is to make sure that we kind of slow down the process. I did do a research project when I was in grad school, which was a really long time ago. And I compared Iowa and Nebraska to see if there were more gubernatorial vetoes in Nebraska, and there really weren't. So, you know, with the idea that if you don't have a second chamber to check. So I'm a huge supporter of the unicameral process. I think other states should consider it. It was proposed, it was on the ballot in 34. I don't know, again, you're all too young to know, but 34 was kind of the height of the Depression. And people were poor, and of course one of the things that sold it was that it would be cheaper. We'd have fewer, and it wasn't proposed by the legislature. That never happens. I mean, half of them would lose their jobs, so they didn't propose it. This was an initiative process that George Norris and a UNL professor really promoted. It was passed and it did win in 34, and then in 36 they had the first election, and the first unicameral was held January 37. So we broke with tradition, and now it is our tradition. So he is really regarded as the father of the unicameral. One last quick story on him. I gotta calculate backwards here. It was his second to his last election he actually lost his last election. His second to his last election, I'm trying to do the math, would that have been 34, 36, somewhere in there. He had so angered the Republican Party by then because he had supported a lot of FDR's programs. And he kept saying, I don't care if it's a Democrat idea or a Republican idea, I just care if it's a good idea. And so he wasn't being a good party person. And so the last time he ran and won, he, the Nebraska Republican Party found another George Norris, who was a grocer in Broken Bow, and got him on the ballot as well. They had different initials, but put him on, hoping to confuse the voters so that he wouldn't get elected. Thereafter, he ran as an independent because and again, that shows his kind of non-partisan nature. Don't care if it's Republican, Democrat. Care if it's a good idea. Okay, so that's number one. I won't spend as much time on everybody, I promise. And I'm not doing them all. There's 27, by the way, so there you go. The second inductee, and of course the first woman in the Nebraska Hall of Fame, was Willa Cather. She had won the Pulitzer Prize for her book One of Her Own, which is about a young man during World War I on the farm who eventually signs up. He's had a deferment, but he signs up for World War I. And of course she has many other famous novels. And who knows what exciting thing happened for Willa Cather recently.
The letter she found?
Well, yeah, Andy Jewell has done, yeah. And I mean, the Willa Cather Foundation is just flourishing down there in Red Cloud. And they have done so much with the Opera House. And, yeah. If you haven't been there, you should go. They just redid her bedroom with the wallpaper, that flowered wallpaper, etc. Now, I would say, I mean, great for the foundation. In fact, we worked with the foundation on this. In 2018, the Nebraska legislature decided it was time to rotate the two full-body statues that are in the U.S. Capitol building. Every state gets to send two full-body statues of people to the U.S. Capitol building. We sent our first ones in 1937. You may know who those original two. There was two men, and you've already said their names. J. Sterling Morton and William Jennings Bryan were the two men that we had representing Nebraska, and they had been there since 1937. So the Capitol, U.S. Capitol Commission, it's got a full name, allows you to change your statues when so desired by your state. So in 2018, the Nebraska legislature decided, and not in any anger against those two men, but just they've been there since 1937. Let's send somebody else. And so they did Standing Bear, and they tasked the Nebraska Indian Commission and Judy Goshkobosh with the task of doing that. Well, they already had a full statue of Standing Bear, and so they could just commission another one from that same mold. And so they were able to turn that around really fast, and they got him inducted in the fall of 2019 in Statuary Hall. And if you ever go. Statuary Hall is the old House chamber, and it's the entrance into the House chamber. And he's literally, and he's very formidable and big. He's standing right there, and as you enter into the House chamber. Well, the other one was Willa Gavitt. And so they charged the Nebraska Hall of Fame, because we have nothing to do, with putting her. Well, we didn't, all we have is a bust, because in the Hall of Fame in our state capitol is just bust. And what they require at the US Capitol is a full body statue. So we had to start with, okay, first off, we got a mega statue, because there is no full statue. There's no mold out there. So we started that with an RFP for that. Picture here. Oh, she kind of got cut off at the top, dang. But that's Willa Gavitt, and that's some of our committee that were there, and we were pushing the envelope. They gave us the bill was passed in June of legislative session of 2018. They gave us till June 30th, 2023, 5 years. Should be plenty of time. But you all know what happened in 2020, we had the pandemic, anyhow, everything got slowed to molasses. But we finally got her in to the Nebraska, or as the Nebraska representative in the US Capitol. She's not right, they had them standing side by side for this ceremony, which was awesome. So we were in the old House chamber for the ceremony. But now she's actually down in, right as you come into the visitor center. So she'll probably actually get seen by more people there. And she is the first and only Pulitzer Prize winner in Statuary Hall in the US Capitol. So that's pretty impressive. I think it was the 11th woman and the first. The other thing we thought was kind of cool was our artist. Oh, I hate moments like this.
Littleton Alston.
Thank you. Littleton Alston was our artist. This is the first statue in Statuary Hall by a black artist, by a black sculptor. So that was pretty, that was a pretty big deal for people in DC as well. So there you go. Okay, so 1 and 2. Other women in the Nebraska Hall of Fame. Mari Sandos, she was next, then Vestria Aldridge, both of them, of course, authors from Nebraska. And then Grace Abbott, and a lot of people don't know, Grace Abbott was a social worker. She and her sister were both social workers from the Grand Island area. And she never married, but as I said, she had many children. And she went on to work, let me check my notes. She worked for the US government. In the department, let's see, she became she taught at the University of Chicago, got a PhD in political science. This is back in the early 1900s, so again, pretty unusual for a woman in that time period. Worked on child poverty, public health, and welfare issues. She became, in 1917, so we've been right around World War I, she became head of the Child Labor Division in the Department of Labor, and eventually in 1921 through 34, she was the head of the entire Children's Bureau in the Department of Labor. Issues of childbirth, child labor, and juvenile justice. So, and then ended her life being a professor at the School of Social Science at the University of Chicago, serving under her sister, who was the dean of that particular school, dean of School of Social Sciences. So that's Grace Abbott. And then Suzette LaFlèche-Tibbles, if you know the story of Standing Bear. Suzette is, of course, the person that served as the interpreter for Standing Bear during his trial to be able to return to Ponca homelands up in the Niobrara region. So those are the women. So there are 5 women. The first Native American that was inducted into the Nebraska Hall of Fame was, of course, Standing Bear, the Ponca chief, the story of the Poncas being removed. I just love the bison up there. I just had to throw that in. I thought that was cool. Again, his story, the Trail of Tears in 1878, where they were forced to the warm country. What's the warm country? Who knows what the warm country is? Oklahoma. Yeah. And their return trip back in January of 1879, he was arrested by General Crook. There's some good documentaries out there. Probably my favorite book on this is the I Am a Man book, if you haven't read that. That the hand is not the color of yours, but if I pierce it, I shall feel pain. If I pierce your hand, you shall also feel pain. The blood that will flow from mine will be the same color as yours. I am a man, hence the name of that book. And again, as I mentioned earlier, he was inducted into the U.S. Statuary Hall in 2019 as our representative. So you might ask, so where are the full statues of William Jennings Bryan and J. Sterling Morton? William Jennings Bryan is at the National Guard Museum in Seward, which is interesting. There were some places in Lincoln that wanted it. Of course, Bryan Hospital, his home, but it ended up in Seward. But J. Sterling Morton is home in Nebraska City. He is in the public library, which is the Morton James Public Library. Morton for his son, who donated the money for the library. His son was Morton, fame of Morton Salt. J. Sterling Morton's son. So it's appropriate, and they're beautiful statues. In fact, he's in the new part of the library, but they still had to go in and reinforce the floor to bring this monstrous full-size statue in. Other Native Americans that are obviously we already talked about Suzette, she's Native and a woman, but Red Cloud is the other Native American who is in the Nebraska Hall of Fame already. Our first Black person in the Nebraska Hall of Fame is Malcolm X, that we just inducted on May 22nd of this year. I will tell you, he is the 27th inductee. We had a huge crowd. Chris was there. Anybody else? Was anybody else? We had a huge crowd. It was a beautiful ceremony. Malcolm X's daughter attended and gave a riveting talk. The Malcolm X Foundation in Omaha has been very instrumental in this process. Again, I've been through 3 rounds of nominations for the Nebraska Hall of Fame. He was nominated before I came on the board of the commission, and then he was nominated the first time I was on the commission, then 6-7 years ago he wasn't nominated, and then he was nominated again. They really had their nomination lined up this time. I mean, they had people testifying at all 3 congressional. We go to the process is once we get the nominations, and I'll talk a little more about that when the next one's due at the end of this. Then we look at them and make sure they all qualify, because we've had some that were, as I showed you earlier, it's pretty easy to qualify, but I think one time they wanted, we got a nomination, who was it? Of a famous musician who, for a short period of time, like a year, lived in Nebraska, but didn't grow up in Nebraska, wasn't born in Nebraska, didn't achieve fame while in Nebraska, but was famous. And we're like, no. So we do that, and then once we determine that all our nominees meet the criteria, then we go to a congressional, we hold a public hearing in all 3 congressional districts. In fact, my first round, we held it, so it was probably 15, 16, 17 years ago, we held it here at the Norfolk for the first congressional district. This last time we held it in Lincoln, but we do go to all 3 congressional districts. The Malcolm X Foundation had testimonials in all 3 congressional districts. They had, and again, their argument was he made the change. He may have started off as a very angry man, but he made the change and he became a human. He didn't even like to call it civil rights activist, but a civil rights I'll take that back. Not a civil rights, but a human rights activist. So, anyway, there were other good nominees, and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, I did go ahead and list all the other Nebraska Hall of Fame members that William Jennings Bryan, J. Sterling Morton, Buffalo Bill Cody, John Jay Pershing, World War I. And again, he wasn't born here, but he was here for a period of time running the cadet program at UNL. John Neihart, the Nebraska Poet Laureate for a long time. Gilbert Griswold and Robert Furness were governors. I think those are the only 2 governors that have been selected. Robert Furness was our second governor. Our first governor got impeached, if you didn't know that, and convicted. So. There you go. A little rough start there. There you go. Edward Creighton of Union Pacific fame. Charles Vesey was the Halsey National Forest. Thomas Rogers Kimball was one that I was involved with. He's the obviously a great architect. Was it St. Cecilia's Cathedral in Omaha is one of his. The thing I liked about Thomas Rogers Kimball that I didn't know until we got the nomination, and so I got time. He was the one, so he's a famous architect, studied over in Europe, could have stayed in Europe, been famous over there, could have gone anywhere and been famous. He came back to Omaha. For me, that's always one of those criteria I really liked. That he was from here, left, and chose to come back. But you don't have to do that to qualify, but it's one of the things I liked about him. But the other thing, as a famous architect, when we went to build our 3rd state capitol, he was on the commission that set up the process. And he came up with something that probably greatly influenced the capitol that we had. He came up with the process of a double-blind competition for the architects. So, a blind competition was common, and that was that the people who were going to make the choice of which plan to go with didn't know who the architects were. Okay? So in other words, you get the drawings, but you didn't know who gave you those drawings. The double blind was the idea that the architects didn't know who the commission was that was going to be picking the design. And the idea there was, because if you knew who was on the commission that was going to pick the design, then you'd go study what they liked, and you would submit a design that you thought they would pick. So by doing double blind, where the commissioners didn't know the architects and the architects didn't know the commissioners that were going to make this selection, the architects could, do what you want to do because, you don't know the likes and dislikes of the people who are going to make this selection. And they think that's why they got such creative designs and why the Nebraska State Capitol is so unique among state capitals. And that was Thomas Rogers Kimball's plan. And then he was the man that oversaw the building of the state capitol from the architectural point of view. He wasn't the architect. He was part of those commissioners who said, I don't want people to know I'm going to be picking the design, or they'll try to please me. I want them to come up with something unique. So even though he wasn't the architect of the Capitol in many ways, because of that double-blind competition, we have the state Capitol that we have. The other probably prominent public building that you might know is the Hall County Courthouse, which is a beautiful building. He's got lots of buildings. Arthur Thompson was an auctioneer, a famous auctioneer. I got that right. Nathan Gold was a businessman, downtown Gold Store, downtown Lincoln. Roscoe Pound was professor and president of Harvard Law. I'll mention him in a little bit. He was also of that cohort of Cather and Sandos and some of those people that were all there at the same time at the university. Father Flanagan, Boys Town. Hartley Burr Alexander is the guy, he's from Syracuse, Nebraska. He was a UNL philosopher, and he's the one that came up with the words that you see chiseled in the state capitol. My favorite one is that one on the north portico, kind of the front. It says the salvation of the state is watchfulness in the citizens. That's a Hartley Burr Alexander. And there's lots of great quotes in the state capitol, and they're Hartley Burr Alexander. Lauren Isley is a writer. Gilbert Hitchcock, a newspaperman. Oh, I got Gilbert Griswold. Oh, Dwight Griswold Gilbert. That's the same person. I think that's the governor. I must have missed it. And then my first one, that when I was on the commission, is Albert Saunders Johnson. Johnson. I hate it when I make typos, so there you go. Two of them right there on that page. Alvin Saunders Johnson. He's from Pender, Nebraska, grew up in Pender, but went on to and lived most of his adult life back in New York. He was the man that realized he was a great intellect, and he began to realize in the 1920s and 30s that there were some intellectuals over in Poland and other parts of Russia that were Jews that were being persecuted. And so he was very instrumental in helping get many of those Russian Jews and Polish Jews and German Jews out and over to the United States before the war broke out, saving many lives. Would you say? Oh, I got 10 minutes? Okay, I'm getting close anyway. He then also was the founder and longtime president of the New School of Social Science, which was the first school aimed at adult education. So it was this idea of you don't have to be 18 to go to college, you can be 32 and go to college. And then many of these people that came to escape persecution of Jews in Europe were employed as professors at that college. And he's from Pender, Nebraska. So there you go. And then, last but not least, up on the 14th floor in that memorial chamber, if you're a Nebraskan who is a Medal of Honor recipient, you are technically in the Nebraska Hall of Fame. They just have their names listed up there. But they automatically qualify. That's not something the Hall of Fame decides. So, okay. Okay, so here's where I wanted to leave it. Who's next? Let's see. The next nomination cycle, because again it's a 5-year cycle, they're due December 31st, midnight, New Year's Eve, 2026. That's when the next ones are due. So you got a few years. And there's some possible people out there. And all that I have listed here are people who would qualify, and that they've been gone 35 years. So Johnny Carson's not up there. For those of you in Norfolk that love Johnny Carson, which I don't like. I miss Johnny Carson. Louise Pound. Notice I mentioned Roscoe Pound a while back. Louise Pound was his sister. Famous athlete. She was a female athlete when there were no female athletes, so she competed with the men and beat them. So she was a world-renowned tennis player. Again, this is the early 1900s. And she was also, I assume you've heard of the Modern Language Association, MLA, that when you had to do footnotes. She was the first female president of the MLA. She was a professor of English and folklore at the University of Nebraska in the early 20th century. And Roscoe Pound, when they told him he had been nominated to the Hall of Fame, he goes, "Why am I in the Hall of Fame? Louise needs to be in the Hall of Fame." But she still isn't, so there you go. Howard Hanson's a famous musician, the Eastman School of Music, president there for a long time. Person I just learned about recently was Father Hiram Kano. He was a Japanese American from an influential family in Japan. And as a Nebraskan, he had been campaigning to allow Japanese Americans to own land in Nebraska because there were a lot of rules against that. And as a result, he's the only Nebraskan who got put in a relocation camp because they saw him as so influential among those Japanese Americans in Nebraska. John Philip Falter, the illustrator from the Saturday Evening Post. Erwin Hinckley Barber, he's a geologist. Eberhard is a writer. Wright Morris is a writer and photographer. Evelyn Sharp, a pilot out of Ord, Nebraska. And then Susan LaFleche Picot, that would be Suzette's sister. She's the first American Indian doctor with a medical degree. And some of you may know up at Walt Hill, they're trying to restore her hospital up there. Others, I mean, this is not a definitive list by any means, but can you think of others that you're thinking, yeah, we ought to consider them down the road for the Nebraska Hall of Fame? We've got, I guess my point is, we've really got some great Nebraskans out there from the past, and we're building more and creating more great Nebraskans right now. We do have a vacancy on the Hall of Fame Commission. So if you'd like to be considered, you send an application. There's an application on, it'd be historynebraska.gov/Hall of Fame. And it would take you, you'd probably just Google it and you'd find it. But we could use another, we have a vacancy. There's no requirement for geographic distribution. There is a requirement for partisanship. That there are 7 of us, 6 are appointed by the governor. The 7th is the executive director of History Nebraska. And then they serve as kind of our agency that houses us and as the secretary of the organization. So you can be reappointed. I've been reappointed 3 times. They're 6-year terms, 2 of us every 2 years for 6-year terms. Ron Hall was the former chair before me, and we miss him terribly. So, thoughts, comments, questions? Yes.
They have to be dead for 27 years.
35.
35 years, okay. Where did they get the 27? I don't know. Anyway, it seems like a long time.
It does. We again, initially there was no time. Then it was 10 years. Again, there was, when one person got in that they thought was kind of a crony thing, that's when they bumped it to 35. I suppose you could look at the argument that your legacy is cemented after 35 years. But who knows, we like to rejudge people in contemporary times sometimes, so there you go. And there's been some criticisms of some of our past ones that are in there.
Not everybody's
Yeah,
going to be,
yeah.
Because
So
I
there
see
you are.
some people up there that should already be in as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Susan LaFleche, Evelyn Sharp, gave her life for her cancer.
Yeah, there's some, and it's kind of sad in that, one every 5 years. I think the other issue is, Malcolm X filled the last niche. So the original 6 are in that entrance into the state capitol building. When you come in that north entrance, they're right there. And then after that, they're down those side halls on either side of the unicameral and the old Senate chamber. So there's some talk about where's the next one going to go, because those are all filled. We have filled all those. Yeah, I'm sure we can find a way to put more bust in there. And I think it's a great way to tell the history lesson. They all have plaques that have their years and what they're known for, et cetera, et cetera. So I should have brought the picture of Malcolm X's plaque, because it's got a great quote on it that I think can be a really good learning tool for Nebraskans as they go see that in the Nebraska Hall of Fame. So I will tell you this. The person I voted for every time has not won. Because we don't all, these are tough decisions. But in the end, we always cast a unanimous ballot, kind of, to show our support that, yes, this is a great person, and they're worthy of it. May not have been my first choice, but it's a great person that should be in the Hall of Fame. And what we read to make these selections, and then the congressional testimony, it's a lot of information, but that's, to make an informed decision. These are not easy decisions. I could vote for any of those people, but you only can vote for one. So that's what makes it kind of tough, but makes it special as well.